Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon. It's Culture Day, and you're very welcome to IMMA's Culture Day Interculture Night programme. For this segment, it's the hidden histories of IMMA. And my name is Stephen Taylor. I work in the IMMA Development Office, and I'm delighted to introduce my colleague from IMMA, artist, writer, and member of the visitor engagement team, and resident expert on the heritage of this site, Barry Kehoe. Barry, it's lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Here we are, we're in the North Range of the Royal Hospital, Kehoe. IMMA's on site here, as you know. But as we stand here in what's the chapel part of the North Range, it's a place that's full of history.
Totally, yes. The chapel that we're in, and this is the larger ceremonial rooms of the Royal Hospital, they would all have been completed about 4 to 6 years after the hospital was begun to be built in 1680. And so we're finished a little bit later. But in terms of historic interiors, this is one of the most spectacular ones in Ireland, in Dublin and in Ireland. With what remains in situ is, first of all, I think if we look towards the window here, you can see all this beautiful woodwork, all this beautiful oak carving. It's all the work of Huguenot refugees, essentially, that came. They were brought into Ireland by the Duke of Ormond. They were being persecuted in France for being Protestants. And so, like the rest of the United Kingdom as well, and under the reign of Charles II, they brought quite a lot of these religious refugees into places like Ireland and the UK to use their skills as well. So there was kind of a requirement that you had to bring some kind of unique skill with you as well to be accepted, to be given the freedom of a city like Dublin. So the man responsible behind this is a man called James Tabry, and his two brothers were also, they came with him, and they would have worked on most of the woodwork. So it's a beautifully ornate, Baroque, carved, rear Dawson window surround. Now, it's not exactly the same as it was when it was originally installed, because in 1849, which is much later in the life of the hospital, the window was altered and changed. So the beautiful stained glass windows that we see, they were a gift from Queen Victoria in 1849 after a visit to the hospital. Now, unceremoniously, because they didn't really care about heritage in the past as much as we do today, they tore out all of the woodwork, and there's watercolour paintings in the chapel, all the woodwork missing. It was removed to accommodate the window, and the original window was only half the size. You can actually see, when you look around just to the inset of the window, there's these beautiful carved oak leaves, and they only go around to halfway down. And at that point, this is where the window ended. Okay. And the wooden panel that we see in the centre would have projected much further out, a much more three-dimensional kind of structure. Now, the glass itself, the design is really beautiful. Again, very Victorian, and it's really part of this medieval revivalism that the Victorians loved. These coats of arms. You have the three figures who are Stephen, King Stephen, King Henry, and St. John in the centre. Stephen was the first king of England to give a charter to the Knights Hospitallers, and they had priory on the site up until the devolution of the monasteries after Henry VIII. So this land would have been maintained by them as a defence for the west side of Dublin. And to remember that and the connection of the Knights Hospitallers and the Royal Hospital and the kind of, I suppose, the militant religious element of that soldiery, the window design kind of ties all that history of the site in together. St. John being the patron saint of the Royal Hospital here, and also of the Knights Hospitallers. And then King Henry was the man who actually gave this land here. It's Henry II, in fact, who gave the land here to the Knights Hospitallers. So the window kind of ties in the history of the site as well.
And you mentioned the oak leaf motif. The oak leaf has a particular significance for the king.
It does. So King Charles II, at the time of his restoration, one of the things that became associated with him as a symbol was the oak tree, because when he was hiding from Cromwell's forces, he hid in an oak tree in a forest. And so from that time onwards, the oak, which has always been associated with royalty because it always represents strength and age and long life, but certainly for King Charles II it had kind of a deeper meaning as well. And what you can see in the oak work here and the oak leaves, it's actually continued on into the ceiling. Now the ceiling is a really kind of spectacular work in itself. It's really, really ornate. It's very, very much in its original form and really heavy, like a stucco ceiling. In the original hospital ceiling here, the chapel ceiling, it was made with plaster that was hand molded onto oak branches that were woven into fir branch lattice that was pegged into the ceiling itself. Now the problem with that, of course, is it's very, very heavy, and within a few years as we completed, the ceiling began to collapse. We don't know the names of the ceiling stucadores because they also did a ceiling in Kilkenny Castle, which also collapsed.
Okay.
So obviously, following this kind of overly ornate Baroque style, the ceilings were just too heavy for their design. And what happened then is the ceiling was basically falling apart for a very long time, over many, many years, until in 1903, a man called Jackson from Scotland was brought in, and he replaced the entire ceiling with a papier-mâché replica. So the ceiling itself dates from 1903, the current ceiling, but is in the exact design of the original 17th century ceiling.
You mentioned cabbages and the market garden. Am I right in saying that was a kind of a praise to God for the harvest? And for the...
It is indeed. It's kind of, and again, very kind of Baroque ideas of to conquer the earth, like the military were doing, I suppose, in the hospital, or had done, and making it bountiful and cultivating it, and I suppose putting a rein on nature. So certainly the idea of the plentiful food being supplied, and that would have kind of reflected something that we'll see in the gardens as well of the hospital, which supplied food. Really unique to the ceiling is if we look up at the elliptical pieces up here.
Yeah.
These don't exist in any other ceiling. Are these wonderful handkerchiefs? Can you see them hanging down?
Yeah.
Now the handkerchiefs are all hanging down in these ellipses, and right beside them you'll see there's lilies as well. And the lilies in this symbolism in this period kind of represent the tears of Eve as she was cast out from the Garden of Eden. Her tears, from where the tears fell, lilies grew. And then in the woodwork also, along the bottom, you'll actually find lilies as well repeated. So there's a kind of connection between those men who were carving the woodwork and designing it on the ceilings, that they connected some of the symbolism together, like the cherubs and the lilies in particular.
That's fantastic, Barry, that information on the chapel. I suppose we'll head into the Great Hall.
So we're here now in the Great Hall, and unfortunately it's being renovated at the moment, so it's not in its most pristine condition. But certainly it gives you an impression of the scale and the size of the hall. This is where they spent their day. They come up they get out of their bedrooms, they'd come down here, they'd spend their entire day here, they'd eat 3 meals a day down here. They had a library that was here in these arches, which was closed off, and they had a big extensive library, which you can now find in Farmley House. It's all been moved up there, if anybody wants to research the library. You also have some stained glass windows in here, but not by Michael O'Connor. These ones were done by a man called Child, and he in fact was a teacher of
Harry Clark.
Harry Clark, yeah. So he was Harry Clark's teacher in the Metropolitan School in Dublin, Art School. So there are slightly different glass designs that come from a slightly later period, and it's a little bit more obvious as well when you kind of compare the two.
It's amazing the quality of the colour remains. I mean, or does it? Is it
no,
in the story?
It's interesting that you say that the glass windows are in amazing condition, and the reason why is because in 1940, during the emergency, or World War II, as other people like to call it, outside of Ireland, the glass windows were removed in case of stray bombing, and they didn't get put back in until 1984 during the restoration. So the windows are incredibly well preserved.
That's an amazing, just the foresight to do that, I suppose. There were a few stray bombs, obviously.
And then they just never put them back for so long. Because I suppose this building was neglected. I mean, it sat empty for many, many years. It was the Garda Síochána headquarters until 1957. And then it was just abandoned. It became a storage house. That's why the Royal Statuary ended up here and things like Queen Victoria. But certainly, the building is very, very well preserved. Some elements because of that closure, and then extensively restored in 1980 to 84 when we had presidency of the EU. They wanted a kind of ceremonial space, grand European scale, because it was, copied on Les Invalides, so it had that very beautiful kind of cultural, I suppose, cachet. And that's why they restored it.
And we're missing, this Great Hall is known for its series of portraits. They're not with us now because they're being, as you said, this has been renovated.
It's been renovated,
but they were interesting because they had a certain insignia on each portrait to let you know who was who. Do you remember these things?
So there's a whole series of portraits here. It's quite an extensive institutional collection. They've all been here since the early 1700s, painted largely by official painters, royal official painters like official photographers would have today. And they come from their studios. We had paintings from Ramsey in London. There's also a man called Poole, spelled Poole, and he was an Irish-based painter. And quite a lot of the portraits came from him as well. But you had kind of extraordinary things like portraits of William of Orange here, which is something that you not see in a lot of public buildings in Dublin today. But certainly, because it was a unique institutional collection, they were kept together. So the Duke of Ormond was here, Charles II. You'd see what they were called swagger portraits. They'd be dressed in their finery, showing off their leg, particularly for those gentlemen who are the members of the Order of Garter, which is the highest ranking knight's order that you can have, and they'd be showing off their beautiful legs in their tights with their garter on their knee, so that you could identify them as the highest knights in the realm.
So everything was considered. When you think of all what you've spoken about the decisions to link every symbol, the same happened throughout their lives. It's almost like nothing was by chance. It was all
very thought out. And when you look at the building itself and the architecture, this was the first classical building built in Dublin. It's designed to overawe you when you enter into the space and you look at it, even from outside the courtyard or inside the courtyard. It's designed so all the lines draw your eyes laterally apart, so you can never really take in the whole building with one look, and it's designed to overawe you. But also, when we look at the windows and the scale and the size of them, it's all part of this Enlightenment philosophy that they started to understand in medicine, that light was good for the soul, it was good for your health. An extraordinary building because it was exempt from window tax compared to a lot of other buildings in Dublin built around the same period of time. You have lots and lots of big windows and lots of light, lots of air. Exercise was a big part of being here. It was a residence. Anyone who was sick, in fact, again, this is more Enlightenment ideas around medicine, anyone who was actually sick was removed from here. And the infirmary is down on John's Road. At the moment it's boarded up and they're building something new around it down there. But anyone who was sick was sent down there. And in fact, that's where the last pensioners ended up. So when the building closed in 1922, and the British military left Ireland, it still took another 7 years to move the pensioners completely out of here, and they went down to the infirmary building. So there's 50 of them went to live down there, not as beautiful and ornate and as grand as here, of course. And then 15 of them had elected to go to the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, where they were accommodated as well. But that was really the end of the hospital's life as the Royal Hospital for the military.
And I remember in the last 10 to 15 years, there was visits from the Chelsea pensioners to this site. I think there was a biannual visit. It hasn't happened recently, but there was definitely a link there.
One of the things that was really interesting about this sort of heritage, particularly anything that's British heritage or British military heritage specifically, it's really since the peace process in Northern Ireland that we've been able to kind of open up a little bit more of a chapter and look at and also present and have open to the public in a much more open conversation anything that is connected to British history and British military history in particular. I mean, when you consider the commitment that Ireland had to British military history, it's quite extensive. The Battle of Waterloo alone, 1/3 of the British Army was Irish. So an establishment like this, there's one here and there's one in London to accommodate all these old soldiers. And it was really Charles II who came back to the throne in 1660, was terrified of what happened to his father, and said, we can't have a situation where feudal lords raise militias and armies and then turn on the king. So what we're going to do is we're going to have, like Louis XIV has in France, we're going to create a standing army. And the standing army was created in the 1660s, in the early 1660s, so that by 1680 we have a problem because all of these soldiers are getting old, infirm, and they're still kind of part of the Crown forces. If they release them and let them go without a pension or a place to live, quite often being feudal men, they would get into a lot of fights, they tended to drink too much, they created a lot of civil unrest. So to create institutions like this was a way of maintaining these fighting men in a lifestyle to which they're used to, with a lot of discipline. And before the police force was invented, the men here used to act as a militia to enforce the law in the city and be on guard duty. That had muskets in the rooms and had parade down into the city on guard duty, maintaining the peace.
And you mentioned military history. The history of Ireland and the rising in 1916 and the crushing of that rising by the British military, that would have been headquartered here General Maxwell would have been here?
So General Maxwell was stationed here. This building became really the centre of operations for the British military side of the rising. So the reinforcements that landed in Dublin, they split into two columns and they marched here in from two different directions. And one of them was a column that got caught on Mount Street Bridge, which is where lot of the killings by the rebels happened, and a lot of the retaliation that happened later on under Maxwell with looking for an equivalent amount of executions against the rebels, and of course the execution of the leaders before the civic power took over again from the military. And that all was kind of done from here. So it was really kind of a central part of the British military operations, and they would have been camped out in the grounds here as well. And the offices down at that end of the building, which were the master's quarters offices, would have been used. And the Adjutant General's, of course, building, which was the administrative headquarters for the British military in Ireland, would have been in overtime over those few weeks.
Extraordinary. Living history. Well, let's head out to the gardens.
Look outside. There's some more interesting things to be found out there.
So, Barry, we're here in the terrace of the formal garden, and this particular piece here is it's got quite a rich history in it. I believe there's remnants of a statue that was here for a short period of time.
Yeah, there's 3 of these beautiful cherubs here, and they're quite massive pieces of work. And they used to be part of what, in fact, was the plinth on which the Queen Victoria statue was sitting outside Leinster House, on what is now the plinth outside Leinster House. And they were all removed from the vicinity of the Parliament in 1948, when Ireland became a republic, and all the royal statuary was removed. Although you can still see Albert in the back garden there, the husband and concubine. But Queen Victoria then restored up here, right up until we sent her away. With a peculiar irony, we sent her to Australia. She sits now in Sydney outside the Victoria Shopping Centre on a nice, well, not as ornate a plinth, of course, but it has a little plaque saying, donated to the people of Australia for perpetuity from the people of Ireland. So we kind of got our revenge on the on all of those.
And the famine.
At the famine, and on all those prisoner ships where it was deported off to Tasmania and Australia.
And the late, great Gay Byrne ran a feature on his radio show, I believe, to somewhere that people would suggest where this statue would go.
At different places around before it went to Australia.
Yeah.
But the Australians are very Victorian. They're almost like 21st century Victorians. I suppose when Australia was really founded and developed as a kind of as a colony, really. They've kind of grown up with this sort of Victorian mentality, so there's an awful lot of interest in Victoria, and I think it was a perfect place to send her.
And has there been anyone on to us looking for the plinth back, or for the cherubs?
No, not indeed. So the cherubs stood kind of underneath her throne, and it's a little kind of triangular, or it was a large triangular plinth, and underneath them then there was bronze soldiers, sort of Boer War style bronze soldiers fallen in battle. And they were all sent to, I think they're out in somewhere around Aylesbury Terrace, or they're at the Knights of St. John, the ambulance, St. John's ambulance headquarters. They actually have bronze statues of the soldiers.
Wow.
The cherubs are here, and down in the graveyards we have larger parts, less ornate parts of that plinth still here as well. So it really was her home, and we got left these kind of beautiful cherubs that represent kind of 3 different elements of creativity. This one, of course, is the visual arts, this little palette here, and of course it's stylus, or it would have been a brush. There's another one further down, and it's literature, so he's a book, or wisdom and history and writing. And then there's another one further over there, and that guy has kind of astrolabe. It's about technology and building and engineering.
Okay.
Architecture.
Well, I mean, it's another example of the hidden histories of IMMA.
Yeah, there's a few interesting little bits hiding around the place.
Brilliant. Thank you, Barry.